Have you ever kept a family secret for decades? I won't ask what, just curious.
The moment I hit the ground, I remember thinking it was almost quiet. Not dramatic. Not even painful. Just this numb, floaty kind of collapse, like my body finally gave up on pretending it could run on air and lies. I was 78 pounds. 17 years old. I hadn't had a proper meal in over 10 days, and for the past 3, I hadn't even had water. My mouth felt like it was filled with cotton balls, my tongue stuck to the roof like old glue, and when I cried, nothing came out except this dry wheeze that barely sounded human. I could barely speak. I just remember crawling across the floor toward the sink like some wounded animal. And my mom, she just stood there, holding a glass of water like it was a trophy. I begged her. Actually begged her. I said something like, "Please, just a sip. Just one." It was the kind of whisper you can barely get out when your throat's swollen from dehydration. I was shaking so badly my fingers scraped the concrete. She looked down at me like I was disgusting. And then, with this look, God, I'll never forget her face, she just tipped the glass, slow as anything, and let it pour out right there in front of me. And then she said, "Not in this house," and walked away. People always ask me why I didn't fight back, or scream, or call someone. But what they never understand is, by the time something like that happens, you're already past the point of hope. It doesn't just start with starvation. It starts way earlier. It starts with someone chipping away at your sense of self so gradually that you honestly start to believe you deserve it. That it's your fault. That it's not abuse, it's discipline. It's clean eating. It's getting right with God. It's resetting your body. It's detoxing from sin. Whatever language my mom used that week, the rules always changed to make sure I stayed at the bottom. She was obsessed with purity. Not the religious kind exactly, but something weirder. More intense. It was this whole mix of raw food, Bible verses, fear of chemicals, hatred of doctors, and this psychotic belief that illness was weakness and hunger was holy. If I complained about stomach cramps, she'd tell me to be grateful I was burning off temptation. If I got dizzy, she'd say my spirit was adjusting. If I ever cried, she'd say that demons were trying to get out through my tears. And if I even thought about saying no to her, the consequences were silent and terrifying. No yelling. No hitting. Just silence. Isolation. And worse, shame. She'd lock the fridge and tell me, "You're on a fast." She'd shut off the tap water for days and say, "We're cleansing." But of course, she ate. She drank. She wasn't cleansing. She just wanted control. I think part of her hated me for existing. I reminded her of the life she lost, the man who left her, the body she couldn't stand. I was too tall. Too loud. Too much like my dad, apparently. And she didn't want to deal with a daughter. She wanted a reflection. Something she could mold into whatever delusional version of herself she thought she was. But I wasn't her. And that pissed her off. So, she punished me the only way she knew how, through food. Or the lack of it. I remember one time I tried to sneak peanut butter at night. It was maybe 1 in the morning. I hadn't eaten in 2 days, and the headache felt like a nail was going through my eye. I managed to get the lid open without a sound, used my finger because I didn't want to dirty a spoon, and I swear to God, I didn't even take a full swipe. I licked my finger and put the lid back on. That was it. The next morning, the jar was on the counter. My mom sat at the table, sipping tea, and didn't say a word. But the look she gave me? I didn't eat again for 5 days. She kept the fridge padlocked. And she said it was to teach me trust. When you live like that long enough, your body stops trusting you. You forget what hunger feels like because it's constant. You stop expecting help. You stop hoping someone will notice. I tried calling a school counselor once, back when I was 14. I said something about not having lunch. The counselor asked me if things were bad at home, and I said, "Well, sometimes I go without eating." She raised an eyebrow and said, "Lots of teenagers skip meals." That was the end of that. So I stopped asking. Stopped talking. Just kept counting days. Kept hiding food under my mattress when I could. Dried crackers, the heel of bread, anything I could find at school or when she forgot to check my pockets. I didn't have a phone. She'd smashed my old one with a hammer 2 years earlier, said it was full of poison and distractions. I wasn't allowed online. I wasn't allowed friends. I wasn't even allowed to sleep more than 6 hours. She had this whole thing about early rising for spiritual clarity. But I wasn't finding clarity. I was losing my mind. The day I collapsed, it wasn't even dramatic. I was mopping the floor. My hands gave out. I dropped the mop. My knees hit the ground, then my face. The room kind of spun sideways, and my stomach just twisted like a dry rag. And when I opened my eyes, she was standing over me with that stupid glass of water. And I cried. I cried because I knew she wasn't going to give it to me. And I cried because that was the moment I realized no one was coming. No teacher. No neighbor. No magic knock on the door from someone asking, "Hey, is everything okay in here?" Nothing. Just the sound of that water hitting the concrete and sinking in like it meant more to the floor than it did to me. I don't talk about this stuff to get pity. Honestly, pity makes me angry. Because pity doesn't help. What helped was the decision I made the next day. I couldn't run yet. I couldn't scream. I couldn't fight. But I could wait. I could plan. Because even though I was weak, even though I could barely stand, there was one thing she had never managed to take from me completely: my mind. And somewhere in that fog of hunger and silence, I started forming a thought. A goal. A simple sentence I repeated every night like a prayer. One day, you'll know what it feels like to beg and watch someone walk away. And that thought kept me alive. Not because it made me feel strong, but because it made me feel real. Like I wasn't crazy. Like maybe this wasn't just my fate. Like maybe, just maybe, I could make her feel even a fraction of what I felt, laying on that floor, bones digging into the cement, mouth open, watching water sink into the ground like I didn't exist. That was the day I stopped being a victim. I didn't escape that week. I didn't even try. But I started watching. I started waiting. And I started thinking about what it would take to make her pay. And that thought? It's the only thing that kept me alive. If anyone had walked into our house when I was growing up, they probably would have thought it was clean, quiet, maybe even respectable, one of those homes where everything's in its place, where the furniture doesn't have dust, where there's no clutter lying around because mess meant sin and sin meant punishment. But that silence, that stiffness in the air, that feeling like you're being watched even when no one's in the room, that was the real atmosphere. You couldn't see the rules posted on the walls because they weren't written down. They were in her eyes. In the way her mouth would tighten if I sat down too long. In the way she'd pause when I asked a question, letting the silence answer before her voice ever did. She never needed to yell to terrify me. That woman could break your soul without raising her voice once. And the worst part was, she always made it sound like she was doing it for my own good. She said food was the enemy. That appetite was the devil working through your body, and denying yourself was the path to spiritual strength. I was 12 the first time she told me that eating was a sign of weakness. I had asked for seconds after dinner, just some extra rice, and she looked at me like I'd pulled a knife on her. She took my plate, dumped it in the trash, and said, "Gluttony is the gateway sin. You want to go to hell over rice?" And from that day forward, food wasn't nutrition anymore, it was a test. Everything became a test. Water, sleep, rest, even the way I breathed. She'd watch me as I walked into a room and ask, "Are you walking in rebellion right now?" I didn't even know what that meant, but I'd apologize anyway, because any answer other than guilt was considered pride. And pride, of course, had to be crushed. It's funny how people assume abuse has to come with bruises or yelling or screaming matches. My mom never raised a hand to me in any way you could document, and that's exactly what made her dangerous. She'd smile when she told me I was failing God. She'd tuck my hair behind my ear while she explained that maybe the reason I was hungry was because my soul was full of filth. She'd say it so calmly that after a while, you start to believe her. I didn't even call it abuse for years. I called it spiritual discipline. I told myself she was just strict. That maybe I was too dramatic. Too emotional. Too hungry. It took me longer than I want to admit to realize that hunger wasn't supposed to be a personality trait. I remember one afternoon, I was probably 15, when I came home from school feeling lightheaded. I hadn't eaten that day. She told me breakfast was only for the faithful and that I needed to prove I wasn't ruled by my flesh. I passed out in the hallway. Literally just collapsed like someone unplugged me. I woke up on the floor, and instead of helping me up, she was standing there with her Bible open, quoting Proverbs. Something about the righteous enduring suffering. She knelt next to me and whispered, "The Lord is testing you. Don't fail him." And then she walked away. That was her version of a mother's love. Scripture used like a weapon, twisted around my ribs so tight that I could barely breathe, let alone question it. I tried asking for help once more after that. I told one of the women at church that I was worried something was wrong. I didn't even say it was about my mom, I just said I was scared I was going to faint in school. She told me to fast and pray for strength. I remember nodding along like that made sense, like that was normal advice for a teenage girl whose hands were shaking so badly she couldn't hold a pencil. And when I told my mom that I'd talked to someone at church, she didn't scream. She didn't panic. She just calmly took my door off its hinges that night and said, "Until I can trust you again, you don't need privacy." And I slept in that room without a door for almost a year. The house became a prison. There were no locks on my side. No freedom. The phone was off limits. I wasn't allowed internet, no library books unless she approved them, no music unless it was instrumental and godly. She said rhythm corrupted the soul. She took the batteries out of the remote because she didn't trust me with temptation. I wasn't allowed to make eye contact with boys at school. I wasn't allowed to shave my legs, wear fitted clothes, or speak unless spoken to. And the worst part was I obeyed. Not because I believed any of it, but because the punishment for resistance wasn't just physical, it was emotional. She'd stare at me with this quiet disappointment that made me feel like the most disgusting, ungrateful daughter on earth. Like she was burdened to even keep me alive. You know how some parents say, "I brought you into this world, I can take you out?" My mom never said that out loud. She didn't have to. She just lived like she meant it. Every day was a quiet reminder that my survival was entirely up to her mood. Some days she'd give me half an apple for lunch and call it grace. Other days she'd fast me for 2 days straight because I looked puffed. And when I asked if I could just have water, just something to stop the dizziness, she'd smile and say, "Not in this house." That line stuck with me, "Not in this house." Like it was a law. Like inside those walls, the rules of decency didn't apply. She made it sound like legal rights didn't exist once you crossed the threshold. And honestly, it felt true. I didn't feel like I had rights. I didn't feel like a human being. I felt like a project. Or a punishment. Or a mirror she couldn't stand to look at unless she was breaking it. I think the worst moment came when I finally snapped and told her, "You're legally required to feed me." I don't even know where I got that phrase, probably from some health class at school. She laughed in my face. A full laugh. The kind that echoes. She said, "Not in this house. The law doesn't live here. God does." And then she poured her glass of water out on the floor while I sat there shaking. And I watched it sink into the concrete like that water was worth more than me. That was the last day I ever asked her for anything. I didn't stop being hungry or scared or tired, but I stopped expecting rescue. I stopped fantasizing about some neighbor calling CPS or a teacher noticing the signs. No one was coming. Not the church. Not the school. Not even God. And in that silence, in that emptiness, I made a decision. I wasn't going to survive by fighting. I was going to survive by learning. Watching. Calculating. Because if this house didn't believe in laws, I was going to become someone who did. I was going to become someone who used the rules she ignored to burn her from the inside out. And I knew I couldn't do it yet. I was still too weak. Still under her roof. Still under her control. But I knew one thing for certain, she wouldn't see it coming. Because she never thought I was smart enough to matter. And that, in the end, was her biggest mistake. There's a very specific kind of silence that settles into your bones when you know that staying means dying, but leaving might mean worse, and for a long time, I lived right in the middle of that silence, balancing on it like a tightrope that stretched across years, never trusting myself to lean too far in either direction. I stayed under her roof for almost another full year after the collapse, and that was not because I forgave her, Not because I forgot what she did when I was begging for a single sip of water, and definitely not because I thought it might get better. I stayed because I had no money, no allies, no backup plan, and the kind of fragile body that couldn't even run half a block without seeing stars. But I also stayed because I needed time to think, to watch, to collect pieces. I knew by that point that nobody was going to help me, not the church, not the school, not extended family, and sure as hell not the cops, so if I was going to get out and make it count, I had to. Do it right the first time. No running away just to crawl back broken. No begging to be let in again after the world outside chewed me up and spit me out. I was going to leave for good, and if I ever came back, it would be on my terms, not hers. I started small. I listened more than I spoke, and I took mental notes on everything: what time she left for the grocery store, what bills came in the mail and what names were on them, what passwords she muttered under her breath when she logged into her weird detox forums, what days she was most distracted, what patterns she didn't realize she was following. I taught myself to move quietly. I found out where she hid her spare cash, not much, just a couple of folded bills between pages of her old Bible, and I took a little at a time, never enough to make it obvious. Just enough to build the tiniest stash I kept buried in an old deodorant tube behind the radiator. When she gave me a rare moment of unsupervised access to the kitchen, I didn't eat. I wrapped dry food in paper towels and stuffed it into a hole I'd cut into the lining of my backpack. When she took naps in the afternoon, I didn't rest. I found a way to steal a minute or two with her laptop, not to message anyone, but to research bus routes, job boards, shelters that didn't require parental signatures. I printed out addresses and stashed them between layers of socks. There was no big blowout, no dramatic fight, no final confrontation. The last day I was in that house looked just like any other. She left to attend a women's group meeting at church, one of the ones where they sit around pretending to be godly while backstabbing each other with prayer requests, and I watched her drive off without looking back. I waited 20 minutes, checked through the window to be sure she was really gone, and then I moved faster than I had in my entire life. I grabbed my bag, stuffed it with my stash, the socks, a few crackers, a sweatshirt that still kind of fit, and I walked out the back door without a sound. I didn't run. I didn't cry. I didn't even look around. I just walked down the alley, past the garbage cans, past the rusted chain-link fence, past the neighbor's porch where no one had ever bothered to ask why I looked like a ghost for 3 years straight, and I kept walking until I was on the main road. That was the first breath I took that didn't feel like it came with a weight on my chest. The bus ride was quiet. I kept my head down. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely count the money, but I made it. 2 hours away, in a different town, I walked into a diner and asked if they were hiring. The woman behind the counter looked at me for a long time, probably saw the bones under my sleeves, the fear still hovering behind my eyes, and she said, "Can you wash dishes?" I said yes. She didn't ask for an ID. She didn't ask where I came from. She just handed me an apron and pointed me to the back. That diner became my lifeline. I scrubbed plates, mopped floors, did every nasty job they handed me, and I did it with a kind of quiet fury I didn't know I had. I rented a room from another waitress, cash only, and slept on a mattress that smelled like mothballs, but it was mine. No locks on the fridge. No Bible verses at breakfast. No one pouring water on the ground while I cried. I got a prepaid phone. Used a fake name. Stayed off the radar. No social media. No contact with anyone from the old world. I was legally an adult now, which meant no one could drag me back, but I didn't feel safe until I was completely invisible. I kept my head down, worked doubles, saved everything. I didn't have time for therapy or healing or any of that soft stuff people talk about when they get out of abuse. I wasn't thinking about trauma. I was thinking about strategy. Every dollar I earned felt like a weapon, and every night I slept without hearing her voice felt like proof that I'd won a tiny piece of the war. And still I watched. Not emotionally, not like a daughter wondering how her mom was doing, but tactically. I found out what town she moved to after she lost the house. Tracked down public records. Learned that she started giving speeches at some community wellness center, still spreading the same lunatic diet advice, still acting like this self-declared expert on purity and fasting. I even watched a clip someone had posted of her on a local news segment, sitting there smiling, hands shaking slightly as she explained the power of spiritual discipline. That was when I noticed it. The tremor. Just a little shake in her right hand. She tried to hide it, but it was there. And I thought, isn't that something? The same hands that held a glass of water in front of me like it was some sacred relic, now struggling just to stay still on live television. I didn't celebrate. Not yet. Because watching her fall apart slowly wasn't enough. I needed more. I needed precision. I needed a plan that wouldn't just make her pay, it would make her feel it. Feel that helplessness. That silence. That same dread I felt all those nights when I knew the fridge was locked and the water had been shut off. I wasn't interested in revenge that looked loud or obvious. I wanted her to think it was just the universe balancing the scales. A slow unraveling. A creeping loss of control that she'd try to fight and couldn't understand why it kept slipping through her fingers. She didn't see me leave. But one day, she was going to see me watching. And when that day came, she wouldn't even recognize the girl she used to starve. Because I wasn't that girl anymore. I had no interest in healing her. No interest in screaming at her or confronting her. I just wanted to make sure that one day, when she needed something simple, something human, like help or care or trust, she'd reach out and find no one. Just like I did. People talk about closure like it's something you stumble into, like one day the pain just turns into peace and everything finally makes sense, like time softens all the edges until you can forgive the ones who gutted you and walk away with your head held high, free and whole. But I never wanted closure. I didn't want a warm ending or some clean moral ribbon to tie around the things my mother did to me. What I wanted was control, not in the twisted, suffocating way she used it, but in the quiet, meticulous way that ensures the scales don't stay tilted forever. I didn't want her dead. I didn't want her punished by the law. I didn't even want an apology. What I wanted was for her to sit alone inside a world she didn't understand anymore, stripped of the power she once weaponized, slowly realizing that the person she considered disposable had spent years building a cage she'd walk into all by herself. Once I was financially stable enough to do more than survive, I didn't rush into revenge. I gave it time. I worked. I learned. I got certified as a caregiver, not because I had any interest in working with the elderly, but because I needed to understand the system from the inside out. I needed to know how adult protective services worked, how assisted living centers were regulated, what kinds of medical decisions could legally be made by someone with power of attorney, and most importantly, what signs professionals looked for when deciding whether someone was confused, paranoid, or just plain difficult. I wasn't planning to become her caregiver. I wasn't interested in touching her, feeding her, or pretending to care, but I needed the knowledge. I needed to know how the machine operated before I could throw a wrench in it without leaving fingerprints. Over the years, I watched her life shrink. Her community presence, those little workshops and healing groups she loved to lead, started to fade once her health declined. I never did anything to cause it. I didn't have to. Her body was catching up to the choices she made. Malnutrition isn't something you can flirt with for decades without consequence, and she'd spent so many years chasing this psychotic idea of purity that her organs just started giving up. It started with tremors, barely noticeable at first, but eventually visible in both hands. She started misplacing items. Forgot names mid-sentence. Spoke in circles. Of course, she blamed toxins, cell towers, the water supply, everything but the fact that she had damaged her own brain with years of self-imposed starvation and pseudoscientific nonsense. She never went to real doctors. Only practitioners, coaches, people who'd nod along while selling her supplements with names that sounded like Latin spells. She was vulnerable now, but she didn't know it yet. And that's when I made my first move, subtle, invisible, impossible to trace back to me. I used an alias, hired a woman from a caregiving network I had connections with, and placed her as a volunteer wellness companion through a community service program I created using a shell organization. It wasn't hard. These kinds of programs exist in every state, little local nonprofits always desperate for unpaid help, always willing to take warm bodies without much oversight. My girl wasn't there to hurt her or steal anything. She was just there to observe, to plant little seeds of confusion. She would move things slightly, adjust schedules, casually mention things that hadn't happened. Nothing that would set off alarms, just enough to make my mother start doubting herself. And when my mother tried to report something was wrong, when she said someone was gaslighting her, moving her papers, changing her calendar, no one listened. Because she had a history of erratic thinking. Because she refused proper medical care. Because she was known in the community as eccentric. And then came the paperwork. I had spent years preparing for this, building a clean identity, filing documents through state systems, acquiring the right permissions. When she started slipping cognitively, I already had a lawyer lined up, someone who specialized in elder care transitions. A few missing bills, a few reports of neglect, just enough for adult protective services to take an interest. Nothing dramatic. Nothing criminal. Just concern. And concern turns into questions. And questions lead to evaluations. And evaluations, when handled by people with the right documentation, turn into decisions. She signed the power of attorney form herself, believing she was filling out Medicare paperwork. The signature was a little shaky, but still valid. By the time she realized what she'd signed, the mail wasn't coming to her address anymore. Her financials were frozen for review. Her access to certain accounts was blocked pending investigation. She screamed at the caseworker, who nodded politely and took notes, marking her down as combative and possibly paranoid. The beauty of the system is that once it decides someone is incompetent, their credibility starts to disappear piece by piece. It doesn't matter how many times she tried to say, "Someone's doing this to me." It doesn't matter how much she insisted it wasn't confusion. Because her mind had been so damaged and her lifestyle so aggressively outside the norm, that no one could tell the difference between her telling the truth and her unraveling. She had no advocate. No friends left. Most of her old contacts had stopped speaking to her years ago. She had no children. At least, not officially. Because I wasn't there. I was gone. Dead to her. And yet, somehow, things just kept slipping through her fingers. And when she started reaching out to lawyers, no one took her seriously. She'd try to explain the situation, but she didn't know who to name, what company to blame, what paperwork had gone where. Everything was legal. Everything was traceable. Everything looked like the system simply doing its job. But I had built every wall around her with my own 2 hands. And she never even saw the bricks going up. The detective came into the picture later, after the nurse I'd hired again, legally, through an agency, filed a complaint about financial instability and mental confusion. Not abuse. Not theft. Just concern. Enough to trigger a formal review. And when he arrived, when he sat across from her at that table and asked her basic questions, she couldn't hold the pen steady enough to write down her own date of birth. She tried to explain, and he waited, patient but unimpressed. She shook, mumbled, stammered, and the more she tried to fight, the more she looked unstable. And I watched the whole thing unfold, quietly, from just beyond the glass. Not as her daughter. Not as a witness. But as the architect. She had built a house where the law didn't exist, where hunger was holiness, where pain was growth, where suffering was obedience, and I had spent years learning exactly how to use the very laws she dismissed to make her world fall apart from the inside out. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to confront her. I just needed to let the walls close in, 1 inch at a time. And now she was trapped in a cage she couldn't explain. A system she didn't understand. A world where her voice no longer mattered. Just like mine never had. There's a kind of moment you don't plan for, not because it surprises you, but because you've rehearsed it in your head so many times that, by the time it finally arrives, it feels almost empty. Like the echo of something that used to matter more than anything else in the world, and then somehow doesn't, not in the way you thought it would. That's what it felt like, sitting there in that hallway, watching through the glass as a woman I hadn't spoken to in over 10 years tried to convince a detective, a calm, polite man who probably thought he was just checking another box on another slow afternoon, that something sinister was happening to her, that her finances were being interfered with, that her medications weren't working right, that something was wrong and she didn't know how to name it. And when he asked her to write down a few details, basic things, nothing complicated, just a name, a birth date, a few addresses, I watched her fumble with the pen. Her fingers trembling so badly, she dropped it twice before finally gripping it like a toddler trying to color inside the lines. The paper shook under her hand, and even from where I was sitting, I could see how hard she was trying to make the letters form correctly. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel rage. I felt clarity. And in that clarity, I realized I had done exactly what I came to do, with no fanfare, no headlines, no closure speech. Just the simple, brutal truth that she had finally been rendered powerless, not by accident, not by time, not by chance, but by the same careful, invisible force she had once used on me. When I left that house, when I walked out with a backpack full of crackers and fear, I wasn't just running, I was making a silent vow that she would never, not ever, see me broken again. And I kept that vow. I stayed gone. I built a life where she didn't exist, not in name, not in memory, not in anything that mattered to the outside world. But inside, where no one could see, I remembered everything. Not just the hunger, not just the loneliness, but the humiliation of being told that even the law didn't apply inside those four walls, that survival was a privilege and kindness was conditional. That memory stayed sharp. It kept me focused. It kept me cold when I needed to be. And now, seeing her in that chair, watching her body fail her just as her words began to fall apart in front of someone who didn't believe her, it was like watching that same glass of water from all those years ago hit the concrete. Only this time, she was the one on the floor and there wasn't a single hand reaching out to help her up. The detective wasn't cruel. He wasn't dismissive. He just asked her to clarify, to slow down, to be specific. But she couldn't. Because the truth was, she didn't know what was happening. She didn't know which accounts had been changed, which forms had been filed, which decisions had been made on her behalf because, over time, I had made sure that every legal move, every medical choice, every financial shift had been done in silence, through channels she didn't even know existed. And when she said the word daughter, when she insisted that this was being done to her by a daughter she hadn't seen in years, the detective glanced at his notes and raised an eyebrow, because the records showed she didn't have a daughter. No next of kin on file. No family listed anywhere. Because I had erased myself completely. Legally, socially, administratively. I was a ghost. And now she was the one they assumed was confused. That's the thing about emotional justice. It's not loud. It's not cinematic. It's not about screaming matches or final confessions. It's about silence. It's about someone sitting alone at a table, realizing that everything they once used to control someone else, silence, confusion, isolation, is now the very thing dismantling their life. She was slipping slowly, and every time she tried to grab onto something solid, a person, a name, a memory, her hand came back empty. And that, more than anything else, was the point. Because she had taught me that survival was about silence, about staying small and unnoticed, about never reaching too far or asking for too much. And I had taken that lesson, sharpened it like a blade, and handed it back to her. She looked up once, just once, and met my eyes through the glass. Her expression didn't change right away. For a second, I don't think she recognized me. I had gained weight, muscle, confidence. My hair was different. My posture was different. I didn't flinch. I didn't lower my gaze. I just sat there, calmly, like someone waiting for a bus, and I watched as the realization moved across her face in slow motion. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. Her lips trembled. Her hand lifted slightly, as if she might reach toward the glass. But I didn't move. I didn't smile. I didn't acknowledge her in any way that would give her permission to speak into my life again. I just sat, still, quiet, like the ghost she had created and then discarded. And I thought, now you know. Now you know what it feels like to beg, not with words, but with your eyes, your hands, your body, and to see someone who could help choose to do nothing. Now you know what it feels like to be dismissed, to be seen and deliberately ignored, to watch help exist inches away, but never reach you. Now you know what it's like to sit on the floor of a life you built out of control and lies and realize no one's coming to save you. When I stood to leave, I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The detective gave me a polite nod, the kind reserved for silent observers, and I walked out of that building without looking back. There was no celebration, no final line, no dramatic flourish. Just a quiet hallway, the sound of my shoes on tile, and the weightless, steady breath of someone who had carried a plan for over a decade and executed it without ever needing a spotlight. People will say it's cruel. That maybe I went too far. That maybe forgiveness would have been better. But those people never lay on a concrete floor at 78 pounds watching water soak into the ground like it mattered more than you did. Those people never spent entire nights awake and hungry, memorizing emergency exits and calculating how long it would take to run from the front door to the road without being caught. Those people never heard someone say, "Not in this house," and realized it meant your rights, your body, your safety, none of it existed anymore. So no, I didn't forgive her. I didn't forget. I didn't try to save her. I just made sure the world finally mirrored back the truth she spent so long denying. And now, while she sits alone in a room she can't leave, confused by a system she can't navigate, calling out names no one answers to, I sleep just fine. Because I didn't just survive her. I outlived her. And I outmaneuvered her. And that, to me, is the only kind of justice that ever made sense.